Senator Cameron. Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I think there is one issue in which everyone in this chamber does agree, and that is that housing affordability is a serious issue and a serious challenge, and it is particularly affecting young people in Australia. And as I've said in this chamber before, I'm keenly aware of that as a younger person myself, because it's my friends and my family and other people in my age group who are right now, today, struggling to enter the housing market, who are struggling to save for a deposit, who are worried that they'll never be able to pay off a mortgage on a home that they would like to live in. So I agree with the concerns raised by fellow senators in this debate so far that housing affordability is a serious issue. I might shock Senator Cameron here, but I agree with him in part as well. I agree with him that although foreign investment in housing is an issue, he is also right to say it's not the most important issue. It's not the key issue in housing affordability. And that's where I disagree with One Nation senators. This government has done a number of things to ensure that foreign investment in housing is appropriate and is regulated as it should be. And in a moment I will go through and document for the record some of those initiatives. But it is very misleading to come in here and to tell young people in Australia that the reason that they can't buy and can't afford a home is because foreign investors are stopping them from doing it. The truth is, and the evidence shows, that this is only one small part of the housing affordability problem. This is a much more complex problem, this is a much broader problem, and to come in here and give people false hope that if we somehow just shut off foreign investment in housing tomorrow, that all of a sudden housing will become affordable and achievable for young Australians is to give them false hope and to mislead them, and I think that is a wrong thing to do. Where I disagree with Senator Cameron is that rich people are the people to blame for the housing affordability crisis. Rich people are not to blame for the housing affordability crisis, just like they are not to blame for non-existent crises in every other product and service market in Australia which doesn't have an affordability crisis. No one comes in this chamber and talks about the national bread affordability crisis or the national milk affordability crisis or the national newspaper affordability crisis. And the reason why no one comes in here and talks about an affordability crisis in those areas is because there isn't an affordability crisis in those areas. And the reason why there is no affordability crisis in those areas is because there are no artificial government restrictions on the supply of those products or services. And if ever price and affordability came an issue in those markets, then the increasing prices would provide ample evidence, ample incentive for people to enter into those markets to provide those products and services, and they would keep those prices under check and under control. Unfortunately, that's not possible in the housing market. If ever there was a market with incentive to get into how the housing market is it. Prices have skyrocketed. There is profit there to be made, and you would think rational profit-seeking people would be leaping to get into the housing market to provide houses for people, to increase the supply of homes, and in doing so help lower the price of homes. Their inability to do so is not because of their unwillingness or lack of interest in doing so, but it is because of the artificial restrictions that governments have placed on the supply of housing. The truth is, when we talk about a housing affordability crisis, what we really mean is a land affordability crisis. The home on top of the land, yes, is a bit more expensive than it used to be, but not dramatically so, not 50% more expensive in 1 year, for example, which is the kind of price increases we've seen in my home state in the city of Melbourne, or 60% increase as we've seen in Sydney particularly. What accounts for that spectacular increase in price is the increase in the value of the land that sits underneath the home. It is a land affordability crisis that we have. Now, in every other market, if we had an affordability crisis, what would we do? We would seek to increase the supply of that scarce good and hope that the prices would fall, as they always do. In this market, though, governments, and particularly in this place, state governments and local governments, have artificially restricted the supply of land. And so people who want to supply the market, who want to provide more affordable homes, have less ability to do so. For the record, I want to just detail briefly some of the foreign investment controls that this government has put in place to respond to the concerns of the community that it is a factor influencing housing affordability. For example, in the most recent budget, we limited foreign ownership in new developments. The government's ensured that dwellings in new developments in Australia are going to be kept available for Australians by introducing a 50% cap on foreign ownership in new developments. That means that Australians who want to buy a home in a new development, whether that's an apartment block or a housing estate, that at least 50% of that will be quarantined and set aside for local buyers, and only 50% of it can go to foreign buyers. Another measure in this budget is to charge foreign owners who leave their residential properties vacant. One of the certainly persistent concerns in the media has been that foreign investors are buying properties here in Australia and they're not leasing those properties, they're not making those properties available to be rented, and that's contributing to the lack of housing affordability. So one of the measures again announced in the budget this year is if a foreign-owned residential property is left vacant for more than 6 months in a year, a charge will be levied on that foreign owner equivalent to the foreign investment application fee which was paid at the time of application. And this initiative hopes to encourage those foreign investors who might be buying homes in Australia and leaving them vacant to make them available to rent, because housing affordability is not just about purchasing a home, it's also about being able to rent a home, and the more availability of that, the better. Another initiative in this budget is to improve the integrity of capital gains tax rules for foreign investors to make sure that the law is being adhered to there. We do not want foreign investors to avoid capital gains tax that they are required to pay, and we do not want to encourage people to invest in homes in Australia under the false belief that they can avoid capital gains tax. They need to pay the capital gains tax that they're required. And we're doing so by bolstering the foreign resident capital gains tax withholding regime by increasing the withholding rate from 10% to 12.5%, as well as increasing the number of foreign residents caught in the regime by reducing the threshold from $2 million down to $750,000. Of course, that's not the only initiative in the budget on housing affordability. One measure which I know is particularly valued by young Australians, is the First Home Super Saver Scheme, which allows them to use their superannuation account to save towards a deposit for their first home. Contrary to speculation and perhaps some fear-mongering in the media, this is not a drawdown on the compulsory contributions that they make, that they are paid through their work into superannuation, but it is extra contributions that they choose to make from their before-tax income above and beyond the minimum 9.25% contribution that they make. And they will do so in a tax concessional way, which will allow them to save more quickly and to save more than they may have otherwise been able to save. And we hope that that will solve one of those issues in entering the housing market, which is not just servicing a mortgage, which is a difficult thing to do, but what many young people say is an even more difficult thing to do, is to save a sufficient deposit to get into the housing market in the first place. There are other initiatives in the budget, including a national housing infrastructure facility, unlocking Commonwealth land, which is one of the few levers that the Commonwealth Government has in terms of land supply. We are a landholder, we are a landowner, and the government is seeking to make as much of that as possible available for home development. I think that's a really important and welcome initiative. One of them is in my home state of Victoria, in the suburb of Maribyrnong, which could build, I believe, up to 6,000 dwellings, and that would be a really substantial increase in supply in an inner urban area in Melbourne. I think that's a really welcome initiative. But as I conclude, I think it is worth pointing out, again, as I have done before in this place, that overwhelmingly the levers to improve housing affordability lie with state governments and local governments. And while ever they choose to artificially restrict the supply of land, both on the fringes of our cities with urban growth boundaries, as we have in my home state of Victoria, which limits development outside of that boundary, or within urban areas, restricting heavily what one can build on a plot of land, or on how long it takes to get approval to do so, on how expensive it is to do so. As long as those restrictions remain in place, then housing will not be as affordable as it should be. All the international evidence shows that cities around the world that have the most liberal, most open land release policies, that have the most liberal, most open development procedures and policies, are also those which have the most affordable housing. There's no reason why Australia could not have that too. We have plentiful supply of land, and that will require some change in attitude from our state and local governments.